Presented with respect. The Memoirs of Vietnamese Special Forces veteran, Vu Quang Dong. Welcome back to the Raw Truth Vietnam War Memoirs. In the previous chapter, only 11 men remained. Against overwhelming enemy forces, we relied on patience, discipline, and a carefully prepared trap. The battle was fierce, the outcome uncertain, but surviving the ambush was only the beginning. War does not end when the shooting stops. Sometimes, the most dangerous moments come afterward. This is part by The Lucky Escape. A short distance after leaving our hiding place, a bomb landed exactly where we had been lying only moments before. Every one of us felt a chill run down our spine. A close call, a very close call. Enemy artillery was firing continuously. One barrage blocked the front, another sealed off the rear. Trees crashed down all around us. In a struggle between life and death, courage should never be wasted recklessly. The enemy helicopters arrived much faster than expected. We had no choice but to run, and hide, and run again. The helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting surrender appeals one moment, ready to open fire the next. Any place that looked suspicious became a target. The gunfire sounded frighteningly close, almost as if they could already see us. Knowing their habits, I reminded everyone to move in short bursts, from one mound of earth to another, from one bush to the next. Move quickly, but never shake the trees. Never leave a visible sign of movement. Slow. The worst were the rockets. They seemed to have eyes, following us, mile after mile through the jungle. In reality, the enemy had many artillery bases nearby. Their guns were firing at pre-registered coordinates. The shells landed all around us, scattered, but everywhere. And if you happened to run through the wrong coordinates, you would simply disappear. There was no time to think, no time to plan. We simply kept moving, trying to escape the helicopters circling above us. Death seemed to be running just behind our backs, and because of that, every man moved faster than he ever thought possible. We ran until our lungs burned. No one dared stop. No one dared slow down. Then, when we finally looked around, we realized something strange. None of us knew exactly where we were. The jungle looked unfamiliar in every direction. Fortunately, we came upon a small stream. Calling it a stream was generous. It was little more than a narrow creek winding through the forest. But after what we had just endured, it felt like a gift. For the first time since the battle began, we stopped to rest. Only then did I remember something important. I had not counted my men. One by one, I checked everyone. All were present. No one was missing. No one had been wounded. Only then did I finally breathe a little easier. There was blood on every man's feet, but not from bullets. We had been running barefoot through the jungle. Sharp roots, broken branches, hidden thorns. They had all done their work. Still, compared to what might have happened, those wounds meant nothing. We encouraged one another. "It's only skin, nothing serious." The words sounded casual, but everyone understood their true meaning. We were alive, and at that moment, that was enough. After resting briefly, we continued moving. By then, it seemed we had finally escaped the helicopter's line of sight. The sound of their rotors grew fainter. The jungle slowly reclaimed its silence. For the first time that day, it felt possible that we might actually make it home. I ordered the men to spread out. Each person chose a concealed position nearby, a place to rest, a place to hide, a place to wait. If the bombing eased, we would find our way back after dark. Weapons were checked, sectors were assigned, lookouts posted. Then, one by one, the men stretched out on the ground. Exhaustion arrived all at once. The battle was over, but its weight remained. Far from the fighting now, Kin kept shaking his head. He muttered to himself again and again, "We were lucky, a little slower, and none of us would be here." Long pause. No one argued with him. Looking at the men around me, I could see the battle written on every face. Exhaustion, relief, disbelief. No one looked like a victor. We simply looked like men who had survived. Their faces were blackened by smoke and dust. Their clothes were torn. Their feet were bleeding. Yet every one of them was alive. That was what mattered. As I watched them resting, a thought crossed my mind. If even one man had been killed in that battle, I would have carried that burden for a very long time. Perhaps for the rest of my life. The farther we moved from the battlefield, the more clearly I understood how fortunate we had been. A few different decisions, a few different seconds, and the outcome might have been completely different. Eventually, another problem began to appear: hunger. The excitement of survival faded, and our empty stomachs reminded us that we had eaten nothing for far too long. We looked around. There was little to be found. No fruit, no roots, nothing that could truly satisfy hunger. Only a few wild plants growing near the water. Nobody dared wander far. Enemy reconnaissance teams could still be nearby. A careless search for food might end with a bullet. So we stayed close to our hiding places. In the end, we stripped the tender tips from the grasses growing along the creek. No one even knew what kind of grass it was. But hunger leaves little room for pride. We chewed the soft shoots slowly, trying to convince our stomachs that food had arrived. It was not much. In truth, it was almost nothing. Yet every man did the same thing: chew, swallow, wait, then chew again. Fortunately, each of us carried a small piece of salt on our belt, a habit learned from experience. The salt helped more than people might imagine. It kept us alert, it kept us functioning, and most importantly, it helped us endure until nightfall. Lying there in the jungle, quietly chewing grass and waiting for darkness, I found myself thinking about the battle once again. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many things had gone our way. We owed a great deal to Thao, to Sin, to Anch Tu, and especially to Anch Han of Battalion 205. The minefield had been planned carefully, spread across a wide area, giving the enemy too many problems to solve at once. Without those preparations, the enemy might have surrounded us completely. And if that had happened, I doubt any of us would have survived. The more we discussed the battle, the clearer it became. Success had not come from bravery alone. It had come from preparation, from patience, and from many small decisions made correctly. Just as important, everyone had remained calm. No one panicked. No one abandoned his position too early. And when the time came to withdraw, everyone moved quickly. Looking back, that may have been our greatest advantage. We did not try to fight a battle we could not win. We struck. Then we disappeared. There was another piece of good fortune. The enemy had been drawn into the trap exactly as we had hoped. Their attention had focused on the explosions, on the casualties, on the confusion, giving us the precious time we needed to escape. The farther I thought about it, the more examples of good luck I could find. Too many, perhaps. Enough to make a man humble. Later, people would ask about the battle, about the enemy losses, about the explosions, about the results. But those of us who were there remembered something else. We remembered how close we had come. Close to being surrounded, close to being discovered, close to being buried beneath artillery fire. The line between survival and death had been very thin indeed. Years later, I would still think about that day. Not because of what we achieved, but because of how easily everything might have gone wrong. War often turns on the smallest details. As evening approached, the jungle began to change. The heat softened. The light faded. The sounds of the day slowly disappeared. Darkness was finally coming. For the first time since morning, we allowed ourselves a little optimism. Not much, just enough. If we could avoid the enemy for a few more hours, we might actually get home. None of us spoke about it directly. There was no need. Every man was thinking the same thing. A warm meal, a safe shelter, and the simple comfort of seeing familiar faces again. At last, the sun slipped below the horizon. The time had come. We gathered our equipment, checked our weapons one more time, and prepared for the journey home. The jungle that had hidden us during the day now became our ally once again. Under cover of darkness, we moved carefully through the forest, heading back toward our base. The journey seemed longer than usual, perhaps because we were exhausted, perhaps because hunger weighed on every step, or perhaps because we knew that danger was still nearby. Even after surviving the battle, no one allowed himself to relax completely. That would have been a mistake. Many soldiers have survived combat only to be lost on the way home. By the time we finally found our way back, darkness had completely taken over the jungle. The sounds of the battle were long gone. Only the forest remained, quiet, patient, as if nothing had happened at all. We moved carefully through the final stretch. No one spoke much. There are moments when exhaustion reaches a point beyond words. This was one of them. It was well past midnight when we finally reached home. Home, a simple word, yet after a day like that, it carried a meaning difficult to describe. Antu had stayed behind at the base, along with the B-40 gunner. Neither of them had been able to sleep. They had been waiting, listening, wondering if we would return. When they saw us, their relief was obvious. No formal greetings, no speeches, no celebrations, just the quiet satisfaction of seeing familiar faces alive. Ang Tu looked around at the men, counted them silently. Then he smiled. Good. Not a single rice ball wasted. It was such a simple remark, yet none of us ever forgot it. Because everyone understood what he meant. The rice had been prepared for us before the operation. One portion for each man. If someone failed to return, his share would remain untouched. A silent reminder, a painful absence. But that night, every portion had an owner. Every man had come back. And for that alone, we were grateful. We sat down and began to eat, hungry beyond words, exhausted beyond measure. The rice was simple, the meal unremarkable. Yet I cannot remember many meals that tasted better. As we chewed, some of the men laughed, others remained silent. A few stared into the darkness, lost in their own thoughts. Each man was reliving the battle in his own way. I found myself doing the same, thinking about the explosions, the helicopters, the artillery, the desperate retreat through the jungle, and all the moments when things could have ended differently. The more I thought about it, the more one conclusion stood out. We had been fortunate, very fortunate. Preparation mattered, experience mattered, skill mattered, but luck had walked beside us that day as well. That is one of the hardest truths about war. You can do everything right. You can make every reasonable decision. You can fight with discipline and courage, and still not come home. On that day, fortune chose to stay with us. And, because of that, every man sitting around that meal was still alive. We ate slowly, no one in a hurry, no one eager to speak. For a little while, it was enough simply to be there. Looking back now, many years later, I still remember that meal, not because of the food, not because of the conversation, but because it marked the end of a day that could easily have been our last. A lesson I never forgot. Explosives were always in short supply, so whenever possible, we searched for unexploded bombs, artillery shells, and cluster munitions left behind after battles. It was dangerous work, but in war, danger often becomes routine. Almost every day, we moved through the jungle in pairs, searching for dud bombs, unexploded artillery rounds, anything that might be useful. Little by little, our stock of explosives slowly grew. Then, one day, someone had an idea. Why not return to our old battlefield? Why not recover any mines, grenades, or unexploded munitions left behind after the ambush? Looking back now, it seems obvious how foolish that idea was. But at the time, it sounded perfectly reasonable. And that made it dangerous. The surprising thing is that neither Aunt Tu nor I objected. In fact, we agreed almost immediately. Worse still, we decided to lead the expedition ourselves. Sometimes, foolish decisions do not arrive looking foolish. The next morning, Thao, Tai, and I moved out first. Our task was to scout ahead. Kin and the others followed behind, providing support and security. Together, we headed back toward the battlefield from the previous week. The journey took more than half a day. By the time we arrived, we barely recognized the place. For a moment, we simply stood there in silence. The forest we remembered was gone. Bomb craters covered the ground. Artillery impacts overlapped one another. Trees had vanished. The landscape looked stripped bare, cold, empty, almost unreal. Even Thao needed time to orient himself. He unfolded his sketch map, studied the terrain, then studied it again. Only after several attempts did we finally locate what had once been the third mine belt. Of all the explosives we had planted, only a single claymore mine remained. Everything else had detonated. The battlefield had done its work. Moving toward the second mine belt, we began noticing scattered equipment, pieces of uniforms, broken weapons, ammunition, helmets, fragments of body armor. The signs of battle were everywhere. Dark stains marked the ground. Old pools of blood, nearly black now. Several monitor lizards were digging through the soil nearby, searching for food. When they saw us, they simply stared, as if human beings were the strange creatures. The men began collecting whatever useful items they could find. A damaged wristwatch, a plastic canteen, several steel helmets, a few belts, even bayonets still attached. Everything carried traces of the battle. Dried blood clung to many of them. Silent evidence of what had happened there only days before, and ahead of us, the first mine belt still waited. The first mine belt was even worse. If someone were to see it for the first time, they would remember the sight for the rest of their life. We were still nearly 20 meters away, yet the smell of death was already drifting through the air. A sickening odor, heavy and unmistakable. Hanging from the branch of a thorn tree was a length of human intestine. No one knew how it had ended up there. A little farther on, we spotted a monitor lizard chewing on a severed arm. One finger still wore a gold-colored ring. Another few steps, and two more monitor lizards were tearing at what remained of a human head. The face was no longer recognizable. Around us lay scattered pieces of torn camouflage uniforms, fragments of a battle that had ended days before. After nearly 3 months of treatment, Bain Giep finally returned. He still walked with a slight limp. 4 new soldiers came back with him: Quang, Liem, Min, and Ha. All 4 had been wounded and treated at the same hospital. After listening to Bain Giep's stories about our unit, they decided to join us. At the command meeting, Bain Giep listened carefully as Uncle Tu and I reported on the unit's situation. Then, he formally assigned the new arrivals. Quang joined Uncle Tu's team. Liem joined Tai's team. Ha was assigned to Keen's group. Min would remain with Bain Giep as his messenger and assistant. The two seemed to get along particularly well during their recovery. The squad leaders took their new men back to their shelters. Training began immediately. The newcomers had brought additional weapons with them: 2 AK rifles with bayonets, and 2 Type 63 rifles manufactured in China. They used the same magazines as the AK. That gave our small unit 4 Type 63 rifles in total, 1 for each team. The Type 63 had certain advantages. It could engage targets at distances approaching 800 meters. It was useful for precision shooting, and when loaded with special ammunition, it could even be effective against light armored vehicles. There was only one problem. The sights were often inaccurate. We joked that if you aimed east, the bullet might decide to land somewhere west. On the eastern battlefield, a wounded soldier who recovered in a hospital, was allowed to join a new unit. If he no longer knew how to return to his old one, the process was remarkably simple. The receiving commander merely informed higher headquarters, usually by word of mouth, and that was enough. The war always needed more men. When volunteers appeared, nobody worried too much about paperwork. The paperwork could wait. Survival could not. During that same meeting, someone apparently reported the details of our recent minefield adventure. Bay Nejip listened quietly. Then came what we called a serious lesson in self-criticism, the kind of lecture designed to make sure you never repeated the same mistake twice. Finally, he looked at me and said, "You were reckless. Far too reckless. There won't be a second time." Uncle Tu and I exchanged glances. Then we both smiled. Looking back, the whole thing really had been a close call. Yet that evening, when the entire unit gathered together, Bain Yep praised Uncle Tu and me generously. He criticized us in private, but in front of everyone else, he protected our dignity. Years later, after returning to civilian life, I often remembered that lesson. If you must criticize someone, do it honestly and directly, but never humiliate your people in public. Protect their honor, and they will follow you anywhere, even into danger. A few days later, Bay Nejip had been back with the unit for less than a week. When a liaison officer arrived from headquarters, his name was Nam. 2 soldiers accompanied him, carrying ammunition, detonators, and rolls of safety fuse. After greeting everyone, Nam delivered a short message. Headquarters wished to commend our unit for its achievements during the final months of 1971, and they hoped we would continue our efforts. That simple message lifted everyone's spirits. But what touched us even more was the equipment they had brought. For soldiers in the field, encouragement was important. Ammunition was even better. After Nam returned to headquarters, Bay Nejip gathered the unit and outlined our next assignments. As before, my team and Kin's team would continue harassment operations. Uncle Tu's team and Ty's team would focus on hunting enemy reconnaissance patrols and Special Forces units. Because of his injury, Bay Nejip would remain behind at the base. Min would stay with him. Together, they would maintain communications and watch over the camp. Explosives remained our biggest problem. No matter how willing we were to fight, without explosives, many operations became impossible. To solve the shortage, Bay Nejip ordered Ty's team to cross the Saigon River and seek assistance from friendly units near Cu Chi. Whenever they returned, they usually brought back only 2 or 4 demolition charges. Never enough, but better than nothing. The rest of us continued searching for unexploded bombs and dud artillery shells. American munitions failed often enough to become an unexpected source of supply. After several days, Ty's team discovered 2 unexploded bombs. Kin's team found another. Little by little, our stockpile began to grow. Detonators were scarce, so we improvised. Grenades, both ours and those captured from the enemy, were attached to larger charges. The fuses were cut short. Only a couple of seconds remained. Between ignition and detonation, dangerous, very, but war rarely offered perfect solutions. Eventually, our preparations were complete. As complete as they could be. The unit divided into 4 combat teams. Each team moved out separately. Our mission was simple: plant traps, lay mines, and make life difficult for the enemy. To improve our chances, we worked closely with local supporters and village guerrillas from Benkat through Dao Mot, Cu Chi, and Bao Bang. They helped us gather information, suggested routes, identified likely targets, and sometimes they even accompanied us. During the operations, we rarely used large minefields anymore. Explosives were too precious. Instead, we usually planted only 2 or 3 mines, just enough to disable a vehicle or inflict casualties. Even these small attacks created endless problems for the enemy. The more patrols they sent out, the more opportunities we found. The tighter their security became, the more nervous they grew. By the end of January 1972, Uncle Tu's team and Ty's team had fought 5 engagements against enemy reconnaissance units around Ben Ha Thut, Trang, Shich, and the Long Nu Yen area. Kin's team and mine had also remained busy. We successfully carried out 4 separate attacks. 2 involved mines placed along Highway 13 near the road leading into Ben Kat district. Kin's team destroyed an M113 armored personnel carrier and later hit another troop transport vehicle. In a 3rd operation, we traveled farther than usual and ambushed an enemy patrol near the entrance to Thu Dao Mot town. None of these battles would appear in history books. None would change the course of the war. But day after day, night after night, they robbed the enemy of sleep, and sometimes that was enough. Yet the next mission would remind us once again how thin the line was between survival and loss. Whenever possible, the 4 combat teams operated independently. Each team selected roads that enemy vehicles frequently used there. We laid our traps. To improve our chances of success, we maintained close contact with local supporters and guerrilla units. Throughout Benkat, through Dao Mot, Cu Chi, and Bao Bang, they provided information, warned us of enemy movements, suggested promising locations, and helped us choose the best places to lay our mines. On many occasions, they accompanied us all the way to the target area. Working side by side, we prepared the traps together. Because explosives were scarce, we had to use them carefully. Most operations required only 2 or 3 mines, just enough to overturn a vehicle or inflict casualties. No more, no less. Even these small attacks created serious problems for the enemy. The more security measures they imposed, the more opportunities appeared. The harder they searched for us, the more uncertain they became. It became a frustrating game, a game neither side could ignore. By the end of January 1972, Uncle Tu's team and Ty's team had successfully fought 5 engagements against enemy reconnaissance units around Ben Yaha, Thuts Trang, Shish, and the Long Nguyen Yen area. Kin's team and my own had also remained active. Together, we carried out 4 separate attacks. 2 operations targeted vehicles along Highway Shisen near the junction leading toward Ben Kat district. In one attack, Kin's team destroyed an M113 armored personnel carrier. Later, they successfully struck another troop transport vehicle. For the third operation, we traveled farther than usual. After a long approach, we ambushed an enemy patrol near the entrance to Thu Dao Mot town. None of these engagements were major battles. They involved no large formations, no dramatic breakthroughs, no headlines. Yet, they achieved something important. They forced the enemy to remain constantly alert, constantly worried, constantly exhausted. Night after night, their patrols moved through the darkness, never certain where the next explosion might occur, never certain whether the road ahead was truly safe. And that uncertainty became a weapon of its own. The war continued. So did we. Every mission taught us something. Every mistake carried a price. And sooner or later, every soldier would learn that survival alone could never be taken for granted. The next lesson would come sooner than expected, and it would test something far more important than courage. It would test whether we were willing to leave a wounded comrade behind. Never leave a comrade behind. In mid-December, Ichu CE, our team was laying mines near Lai Khe Base, close to where Lai Khe Market stands today. The operation itself was routine. We had done it many times before. But war has a habit of punishing carelessness, and sometimes bad luck alone is enough. We had just finished arming the mines and erasing our tracks when a patrol appeared. It was around 2 o'clock. In the morning, local security forces and village militia were conducting a sweep. Somehow, they spotted signs that something was wrong, and moments later, they were moving toward us. There was no longer any chance of slipping away quietly. We opened fire. Tai and Lam fired their B-Silene launchers. The explosions forced the enemy to hesitate for a moment, and that brief hesitation gave us the opportunity we needed. We ran. Ahead of us lay a wide stretch of mud and swamp. Without stopping, we plunged straight through it. Behind us, the enemy regrouped quickly, and the battle was only beginning. The gunfire alerted Lai Khe Base. Before long, 2 armored troop carriers arrived carrying reinforcements. The situation changed immediately. What had begun as a small encounter was becoming a serious fight. Enemy troops spread out, trying to surround us, trying to force us into a prolonged engagement. And that was exactly what we could not afford. We were badly outnumbered, and every minute spent fighting reduced our chances of survival. Flares burst overhead one after another. The night became almost as bright as daylight. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to disappear. Tai and Lam still carried B-Silene launchers, but each man had only 2 rockets left. I immediately ordered them to conserve ammunition. No unnecessary shots, no heroics. Our only objective was to escape. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, Tai and Lam each fired again. The explosions slowed the enemy's advance. Lam remained behind for a few extra moments, just long enough to fire his final rocket. Then he turned and ran after us. Kin and I covered the rear, while Thao and Sin withdrew, one after another. The enemy kept pressing forward. The flares overhead made concealment almost impossible. To protect one another, we used covering fire. One group firing, the other moving, then reversing roles again and again. It worked, but it drained our strength quickly. And then, something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the darkness, AK rifles erupted, followed by B-SIRS rockets. Not enemy weapons, ours. Reinforcements. Or so it seemed. In reality, another friendly unit nearby had become engaged in its own battle. By attacking the enemy, they unintentionally relieved pressure on us. Years later, we learned it had probably been soldiers from Regiment T. Whatever the reason, their fire saved us. For the second time that night, fortune stood at our side. The battle continued throughout the night. Enemy aircraft appeared overhead. Bombs fell into the forest. Artillery shells followed. Flares drifted through the darkness. The enemy fired almost blindly, trying to trap us, trying to finish what their ground troops had begun. Fortunately, none of the bombs landed directly on our position, but we did not escape unharmed. 3 men had been wounded. Tai and Sin had taken hits to the soft tissue of their backs and shoulders, painful but survivable. Lam was not so fortunate. A rifle round had passed through his right thigh. The bleeding was severe. It took 4 field dressings and 2 vitamin K tablets before we finally managed to slow the blood loss. Fortunately, the round had passed cleanly through. It had not shattered the bone. Had it done so, the outcome might have been very different. The situation was bad, very bad. By the time we reached one of our temporary fallback camps, the first signs of dawn were already appearing. We could not remain there. The area was no longer safe. So despite our exhaustion, we prepared to move again. Leaving a hideout during daylight was something we normally avoided. Doing so without camouflage was even worse. Yet we had no choice. There were 8 of us, moving in a long line, and 1 wounded man required the support of 2 others. From the air, we must have looked like an easy target, but there was no alternative. I made the decision. We would keep moving, no matter the risk. Among soldiers, we often told one another, life comes first. And there was another saying, one that every combat soldier understood. Today we bury our comrades. Tomorrow, our comrades may bury us. Those words sounded simple when spoken around a campfire. But now, the situation was real. And reality always feels different. Whatever happened, we had to find a way forward. For Lam, for all of us. Tai and Sin, despite their own wounds, moved ahead. To clear the route, Lam continued to weaken. The loss of blood was slowly draining him. 2 men supported him, yet even then he struggled to walk. Finally, Han stopped, handed his weapon to Tao, and without saying much, bent down and lifted Lam onto his back. Then he stood and kept moving. No complaints, no hesitation, just another soldier, carrying a wounded comrade home. Kin and I remained at the rear, watching for pursuit. We broke off leafy branches to help conceal ourselves whenever we heard the sound of helicopter blades. Everyone froze. No movement, no sound. We waited until the aircraft passed, then continued again the journey that afternoon. From our assembly point to the mine site had taken only 3 hours. Now, with wounded men, constant caution, and exhaustion weighing on every step, the return journey took nearly 5 when we finally reached our previous rendezvous point. Kin checked his watch. It was nearly 11 o'clock. In the morning, we stopped briefly, not because we wanted to, because we had to. For a few minutes, we rested in silence. Lam had lost a great deal of blood. His lips were dry. His movements were becoming slow and clumsy. His eyelids drooped lower and lower. He was fighting to stay conscious, though he tried his best not to show it. Kin handed him a lump of salt. Lam sucked on it slowly. Nearly half of it was gone already. I gave him 2 more vitamin K tablets, then tightened the bandages around his wound with 2 additional field dressings. There was nothing else we could do. After a short rest, we continued moving. Sin led the way. Tai and I, with the last remaining B-40 rocket, covered the rear. Kin coordinated the men. Supporting Lam, the terrain grew more difficult. Small streams crossed our route. Again and again, we were forced to carry Lam, to keep the wound out of the water. At one crossing, Lam asked for a drink. No one answered immediately, not because we ignored him, but because we all understood how little water remained. Eventually, someone scooped up a small handful, just enough to wet his mouth. Then, once again, we gave him salt and kept moving. Everyone was exhausted, but nobody suggested stopping. Nobody suggested leaving him behind. The jungle path twisted endlessly. The branches we had marked during the previous day's journey became harder and harder to find. Several times, Sin had to stop and carefully determine our direction. Each delay felt longer than it really was. Each minute seemed precious. At last, darkness began to fall. Only then did we finally reach our reserve base. The moment we arrived, I ordered Thao to cut through the forest and return to the main base. We needed help immediately. After that, we organized shelter for the wounded and the rest of the team. The hours passed slowly. At some point, after 11 o'clock that night, help finally arrived. Bai Nyep came personally. Uncle Tu was with him. Alongside them were 2 of our newest soldiers, Quang and Liem. They brought food, they brought hammocks, and most importantly, they brought relief. Lam managed to eat half a rice ration and a small piece of canned fish. It wasn't much, but seeing him eat felt like a victory. After the meal, Uncle Tu prepared to leave. Quang and Liem lifted Lam into a hammock. Han accompanied them to provide security. Together, they began the long journey toward the field hospital. Han accompanied them to provide security. Together, they began the long journey toward the field hospital. To be honest, I expected a harsh lecture. Instead, he simply shook his head and smiled. Not a smile of amusement, a smile of understanding. He knew exactly what kind of day we had endured. Bai Nyep looked at us quietly. Then he said, "When I first joined the resistance, I made mistakes too, and I paid for them." He pulled aside part of his shirt and showed us an old wound, a deep scar. beneath his right collarbone, a permanent reminder. Then he smiled again and said, "Now it's your turn to learn." Years later, I would remember that night often, not because of the gunfire, not because of the bombs, but because of the lesson. In war, mistakes can kill. Experience is paid for dearly, and no one earns it for free. Most importantly, we had all made it home. Years later, we finally learned something surprising about that night. The very first burst of a K-fire had not come from the enemy at all. It had come from Han. Seeing movement in the darkness, he fired first, to stop what he believed was an enemy advance. The sudden gunfire startled Sin. Acting on instinct, he immediately opened fire as well. Across the swamp, Lam, Tai, and Thao heard the shots and reached the same conclusion. They believed we had been discovered. Without hesitation, they sprang up and began firing too. Within seconds, both sides were shooting everywhere. Confusion spread through the darkness. Only after the flares illuminated the battlefield could we finally see enemy soldiers advancing toward us. Only then did our fire begin finding its targets. Looking back, the two B-40 rockets fired by Lam and Tai were probably what saved us. Without them, the four of us might never have made it across the swamp. To be honest, fear played its part as well. That night, we crossed the mud faster than we ever thought possible. Under normal circumstances, walking through that swamp was difficult enough. But when death is close behind, the impossible suddenly becomes possible. The enemy had superior numbers. They concentrated their fire and pushed forward aggressively. At the same time, they committed additional forces to pursue us. It was a dangerous tactic, a tactic designed to pin us down and slowly wear us out. Had we continued fighting, none of us might have returned. That night, we survived. But survival alone was not the lesson. The lesson was something much simpler and something much harder. No matter how experienced you become, never lose your alertness. Never assume. Never become careless. Because in war, a single mistake can change everything. From that near-fatal night onward, we reminded one another of a single rule. Stay alert, and then stay alert even more. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for listening to the memoirs of Vietnamese Special Forces veteran Vu Quang Dong. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us continue preserving and sharing these remarkable memories with listeners around the world.